Thank you so much. Good morning, Minister. It's a pleasure to be here, indeed, in my new capacity. But I can certainly confirm the previous topic that you mentioned. No country can do it alone. When I was Minister for Environment in the Netherlands, we also have our government-wide program that the Netherlands wants to be 100% circular in 2050. And that would be a complete disaster if we thought we could do it alone, right? Because the Netherlands is a very open economy. So the only way for us to actually achieve that is if indeed we get this movement and we collaborate with other countries along the trade routes, basically. And I must say that in my years in the Environment Council, I've always had great relations with Finland, and we've usually teamed up. So I hope that practice at least continues. But now, of course, to my new role. I'm currently with the World Resources Institute, and this year we celebrate our 40th anniversary. We have about 2,000 employees working across 16 countries, and we're actually developing our new strategy at the moment. And a big pivot in that new strategy is that we will no longer only be focusing on climate as the only goal that we're working towards. I think we have all realized across the world that climate, people and nature are completely interrelated topics. You cannot save the climate if you let biodiversity go down the drain or if we continue to have the inequity in the world as we currently have it. So we need to look at those three topics together. And actually circular economy then becomes a very important strategy. One of the points that we made an analysis of when we were developing our strategy was what are the main topics that you actually need to focus on? And these are the topics that WRI currently focuses on: cities, climate, energy, food, forest, ocean, water. And then we have a couple of centers that are basically cross-cutting. But we actually identified that even we were working too much in silos. And so under our next strategy, we will see food, land, water, ocean actually as one natural ecosystem, because there are trade-offs, and I'll talk a bit about that later on. Energy, of course, very much. Everybody understands why that needs to be at any core of strategy for the next decade. But within energy, next to energy efficiency, energy access, we'll also be looking at responsible energy. Where do we source our materials? And then, of course, cities, as the world population is growing, and basically you could say worldwide moving to town, cities are going to be an incredibly important place to actually create change. Also, where it comes to the high density of resource flows that we have there. And of course, finance, economics, and governance, which also means data, it was mentioned just before now, what gets measured also gets managed, are very important points for WRI. One of the new things that we're going to do in our new strategy too is to take a cross-cutting look at consumption and production. And for WRI, that is something that we had been doing actually across our strategy over the past years, but we never integrated it. And now we are going to do that because we have really realized that by only focusing on reducing emissions in the production side, we'll never get there. Because if you make every car twice as CO2 efficient, but you sell 4 times as many cars, your CO2 footprint, your material footprint, your biodiversity footprint still goes up. So next to making sure that the products that we make are cleaner in every sense of the word, we also have to make sure that we address our footprint. And then, looking at Europe, we must say that as a continent, I think we are perhaps leading in the world on sustainability. Unfortunately, we are also one of the leaders in the world in overconsumption. So we have a big responsibility, and I would also say a big opportunity, therefore, to create change, to show that it's possible. And I think with all of the beautiful examples that we just heard about how indeed we can use biomaterials for as long as possible in the value chain, creating that opportunity for maintaining the value of these resources, we have a great opportunity to also show that it can be done. And if we can do it, then we can also show to the rest of the world that there are alternatives, because we need to create those alternatives. A lot of people out there in the world have no alternatives now. And I was speaking to the minister of Gabon not too long ago, and he said, well, you know, I literally have a man standing in the forest with an axe. And he said, yeah, I wish it actually was an axe, because usually it's a chainsaw, right? But picture the man in the forest with an axe. And he's standing there thinking, am I going to cut down this tree? Right? And he's not going to say, well, I won't do that. You know, I'll eat my rice uncooked this evening because cutting down this tree is bad for climate. If he has no alternative, he's going to cut down the tree. And each and every one of us would do exactly the same if we were standing in that forest thinking about, do we feed our children uncooked rice this evening or not? And so the only alternative that we have is to show that there is a better alternative, to also enable those people to provide in their basic needs in ways that fit within the planetary boundaries. But then we will need to find those ways. We will need to work on that. And circular economy is one of those ways that we have to do it. So it's not just a nice thing to do, what we're talking about here. This is actually what we really, really should be working on very hard. Earth Overshoot Day marks the date when humanity has used all the biological resources that Earth regenerates during the entire year. And so at the rate we consume now, we would need 1.75 planets to keep up, and actually that's the average, because if you're Finland or Belgium or the Netherlands, I don't know why Belgium is on my slide, I should of course talk about the Netherlands, it's about 4 planets. So either we get, I don't know, very creative in space odysseys and find 3 planets that can survive, that can provide us with these resources, or we get very efficient, very innovative, very collaborative, and we find ways to stay within our planetary boundaries. And we also dare to look at those more difficult questions of consumption and lifestyle. I think you know more or less where my preference would go. The first, human consumption and production really are root causes of the problems that we're seeing. Climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution, the 3 crises that the UN has identified as being the global crisis that we're facing, they are very much linked to our current consumption and production patterns. The first piece of plastic ever produced, I think it was in the 19th century somewhere at the end, it's still out there. The very first piece of plastic, and everything that has been produced ever since is still out there in some form. Archaeologists, when they do their drilling in a couple of centuries, they will identify our age probably by a thin layer of plastic that is everywhere. So is that really how we want to be remembered? Or do we want to be remembered also as a generation, as the time where people actually came to the conclusion that it should be different and we could do it different? What do we need to do different then? At WRI, we did some research, and we identified actually 4 current hotspot behaviors that need to turn into resilient behaviors. That is in the built environment, in our consumption, in our transport, and in our material use. And the IPCC, in one of their recent reports, also mentioned that if you address consumption-based patterns, you could, by addressing those, reduce 40 to 70% of CO2 emissions, potentially, right? That's more or less the spread. If we're talking about spread, our consumption emissions, or consumption-related emissions, both to nature, climate, and in the sense the inequity, they are very inequitable. 10% of the people worldwide consume about 50% of all of the resources. So there is a big inequity question here. And Europe has this large footprint, like I mentioned. So what do we need to do? We need to go towards a circular economy. A lot has been said about this already. I will not repeat all the excellent comments that I heard from the speakers before me that I very much agreed with. But the most important thing I always like to tell is that when people hear about circular economy, they often think about recycling. But that's really only the end stage. Keeping things in the loop, avoiding materials, see if you can be more efficient with materials, all of that will be needed, and changing lifestyles, all of that will be needed to bring down our footprint to stay within those planetary boundaries that we talked about in the beginning. Waste also, it's a human invention. Nature doesn't know waste. We invented waste. And if you think about how much waste we actually have currently, picture 10 big garbage trucks driving down a road. And of those 10, only 1 drives to a facility where the materials are reused. The other 9 dump their trash next to the road somewhere. Or they burn it and get air pollution often and some form of energy out of it. 9 out of 10, every day again. That is how uncircular our world is today. Not even 10% of all of the materials that we use are being reused. So I would say the economy is still vastly inefficient. That's also the good news, because there's lots of low-hanging fruit, right? There's so much that we can still improve. We're not at, I don't know, a 95% success rate where it's very hard to do the last 5%. No, it's complete opposite. We've only just begun. So let's get started. I'd like to look at 2 topics in particular. Materials for the energy transition and food loss and waste. When I drove down from the airport to my hotel yesterday, I saw opposite to this building, I don't know if you've also seen it, this building that had a sign that lit up "No War." And for me, that was a very clear sign of the very different geopolitical situation that we are currently in. And if you look at the energy transition, the energy crisis, which is of course at the heart of the current situation that we are in, we have to acknowledge that this energy crisis, if we don't really speed up our game, could also turn into an energy material crisis. If you look at the transition that we will need to go through much and much faster, then we will need an increasingly lot of materials which are actually relatively scarce and badly distributed across the world. The International Energy Agency has calculated how much more minerals we will be needing for the energy transition. And just to give you a couple of slides. Total mineral demand for clean energy technologies by scenario. They have some different scenarios, of course, compared to 2010 and 2020. These are, let's say, general across different materials. If you look at individual materials, does any one of you dare to venture how much the International Energy Agency thinks that lithium demand might go up? 42 times, yeah, you read the report, absolutely, 42 times. Cobalt and graphite, probably about 20 times, and the geographical concentration, it was already mentioned by the previous speakers. China holds a lot of the resources, Australia and Chile also do, but then in Chile, Chinese companies actually own most of the resources. And if you think about the components where they're being produced, China again is a very important producer. And if you think about nickel, for example, I think Russia has 20% of the world's resources. So if we think about the material inputs that are needed, we can see that we are clearly up for a challenge. And if we think about the material outputs that's coming out of this still linear economy, we're also up for a challenge. I think we can expect about 78 million tons of solar waste to come onto the world market, and 43 million tons of wind turbine blades. So even if we look at the output from our current energy transition, even separate from the geopolitical context of the input, we are up for a challenge. So we just need to do better. This is a big market. There are big opportunities here, and we really need to make sure that we find better solutions. So we are actually underprepared, and we're also investing. Again, the calculation has been made that there's about a $2 trillion gap in investments actually needed already just on the material side, the mineral side of the energy transition. So we have to, what do we have to do? We have to realize, I think, realization of the challenges is always step number one. Then we have to discover the right public and private partnership models to actually find ways to do this better. And I think in Europe, the European Commission with its battery initiative has really indeed been taking steps to try and get that coherence in our response. We also have to define what responsible mining looks like. Because if we go for this scramble for resources, then maybe people will say, well, everything goes, anything goes as long as we get it. Is that really addressing that triple crisis that we have? How do we avoid that Europe then takes it all and nothing is left for the rest of the world? How is that going to avoid a coal-fired power plant being fueled up in India? A coal-fired power plant in India is as detrimental to climate as a coal-fired power plant in Europe, right? Maybe even worse. So how do we deal with this inequity in the world, and how do we deal with the fact that we also need to supply energy access to those 700 people worldwide that still have no access to energy at all? Think about the man in the forest with the axe. For a coal-fired power plant, of course, on a government level, that is the same. So we have to think about mining. We have to think about responsible mining. We have to think about principles for responsible mining that will enable worldwide to go through this transition as fast as possible, but also as equitable as possible, taking all effects into account. As Europe, we really need to look beyond our own borders to the effects that our policies have. And then, of course, we have to innovate massively. And I loved the example of the graphite. I didn't even know about it. So that was really what we have to do. We have to design for recycling. The first generation is already on the market. The second generation is in production. But the third generation, we're designing it. So let's design for recycling. And then quickly, I'm going through my time, I know. Second example, food loss and waste. Just to give you that perspective that circular economy is not just about the, let's say, the hard material side. It's also very much about soft commodities. Food about 1/3 of the food is wasted, is lost between farm and fork. If you want to feed 10 billion people in this world, we have to get better at avoiding food loss and waste, and at keeping those materials longer in the loop, as I think was explained very well by the previous speaker. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit. We have to increase the better use of our bioresources, and that will also again help create more diversity in supply chains. So how do we get there? This was just to give you a fact. I don't know if you know about food loss and waste. How bad is that actually? Well, after China and India, if you would compile the greenhouse gas emissions of food loss and waste, it's the 3rd economy in the world. That is how bad food loss and waste is. And that is also why it's such an important sector for people, climate and nature to address. And let's keep those materials in the loop. We need them for a circular economy. So what do we need? We need global goals and targets. What gets measured gets managed. The fact that we have a 1.5 degree target in the Paris Agreement gives alignment and gives countries a basis to form their national determined contributions to. We need something like that for circular economy too. We need countries to be able to measure. I mean, in a lot of the NDCs, countries are taking up circular economy projects. That is a very good thing because the community is growing. But how do we measure for doing enough? I co-chair the Global Platform for the Acceleration of the Circular Economy, EMF, also a great contributor to that platform, and many others. WCEF, of course, Sitra, the WEF. We work together with a lot of partners, and it's that kind of partnership that we need. And jointly, we should also be defining what the level is against which we measure our ambition. And Pace has said, actually, if you look at the world, if you look at the rates that our material consumption is growing, we need about to be doubling our circularity every 10 years. To be a fully circular economy by 2050 or just beyond. So about doubling circularity every 10 years, that is what we need to do. But then how do you measure that doubling of circularity? We need metrics. So in the context of PACE, we're working to metrics. How do you then define for your company where you can work on circular economy? We are working on an approach, kind of a course, to enable companies to go through that step by step and identify where they can make a difference. What else needs to be done? It's not just private, it's also public. We also need public governments to step up, to regulate, to incentivize, and to put all the right measures in place. So we have developed action agendas that try to create a coherent picture of what needs to be done. The first thing that needs to be done is that we start to collaborate with partners that we never used to collaborate before. A circular economy is fundamentally different from a linear economy. We have to create waste. We have to start seeing waste not as a waste, not as a nuisance, but as a new resource. And that means that we have to go and find those people for which it can actually be interesting and create new links. We have to look beyond our own borders. We have to think in trade change, because that is the way that we can actually change a global market. Policy is a key driver, I think, and then I'll really wrap up. Trade policy is very important. Extended producer responsibility schemes are incredibly effective. European product policy, like I said, Minister, I hope that your collaboration with your colleagues in the Environmental Council is as vibrant as it was at the time that I was there. European product policy can actually change the world, because it relates also to producers outside of Europe. It's an incredibly effective tool that Europe has. So let's please use it as much as possible. So we try to move society to live in ways that protect the Earth's environment and its capacity to provide for the needs and aspirations of current and future generations. As a co-chair of PACE, of course, I hope that many more organizations and companies will say, we want to join forces and contribute to that goal of doubling circularity. We're here to help you. Thank you so much for your attention.